Welcome, everybody, to MentorTime. Just a reminder, if you don't want to be on video, you don't have to be. Our topic for this session is really looking at reducing implicit bias in your professional brand. I'll tell you the takeaway. There's so little written about what we all can do to control our professional presence, our professional branding. And that's why I wanted to talk about this in terms of the implicit biases there are. And I've been making notes for over a year on things I thought would be useful. So let's get started. We're going to talk first about what is implicit bias in terms of just refreshing for those of us who want to make sure we're on the same page. And then how do we see it? And I put see in quotes because we aren't aware of it. That's why it's called implicit. And then we have to ask ourselves, do I have these biases? Well, we know we all do, but let's talk about what that means. And we'll end, as always, with what should you do? I think I've found a good amount of actionable things you can do that will help you. And maybe you'll even have more ideas when we get started. So what is implicit bias and how do we see it? This was interesting. Just a week or two ago, Hung Lee put something up. He has a newsletter. He's a world-renowned talent recruiter and organizes a lot of recruiting folks around common themes. He has a weekly video cast, and it's always very useful for me, even though I don't recruit people and I'm not an HR talent coordinator. But Bas van der Haterd, the colleague of his, wrote Bias in the 6 Stages of Recruitment. And I thought this is great to see something other than a company being told you must train people. I liked definition, the mental shortcuts we take to make sense of the world. So he defined 6 categories, from the job ad all the way through the screening, and I would say even the hiring offers. And then had how you de-bias your recruiting. I don't know if all of these things work. Some of them require huge political commitments. Other things require work that HR probably should be doing already. But just so you know, they did have some actionable things like making sure your career website is accessible to all people, which we know they always aren't. So let's talk about the bias types. And there's actually a long, long list, but I want to give you 3 views of this from different people, different groups that I've found information on. The first is from Dorothy Dalton. She is a great longtime HR person who now does professional coaching, mostly senior folks. She's a Brit who lives in Brussels and travels around giving talks, but also has a great newsletter if you want her 3+ international company. She puts out great newsletters every week about key issues. And she talks about a career gap bias. We're now in the age of COVID are not rushing to judgment on career gaps, but she unpacked it into these 4 areas of bias that go into a career gap, starting with gender, non-continuous career bias, and I've been hearing more from older executives even about this, seeing it on the interwebs. Workplace skills bias, we know that exists, experience bias, and so I always appreciate Dorothy's perspective on things. I found an interesting webpage from Maryville University, which actually describes the students' role and the university's roles in dealing with implicit bias. So they talk about these 4 categories: race and ethnicity, age, gender, LGBTQIA plus community bias, and then ability bias, which I thought was great, if indeed it meant disabilities. And then finally, there was a Forbes article, and this was about the only thing out of the Forbes article. It was just from a week or so, last year, that listed affinity bias, which is something that Dorothy talks about, Appearance bias, we know that from the early days of Zoom. Confirmation bias, we've been hearing a lot about that in terms of information and misinformation. And then again, commonalities, gender and age biases. So this was just in a recent newsletter from Dorothy's 3+ International. And I don't know where she got the stats from. I need to track it down, maybe look at the Instagram and see if she posted it there. But in interviewing, the chit chat, which people think is warm up. Hi, how are you? Oh, I see you came in with a Red Sox baseball cap on. Male interviews discuss sports 63% more when they were talking to male candidates. Oh, I see, it is bright higher. I forgot that. But good for Dorothy, she called it out. Is this really warm-up chit-chat, or is this an affinity bias? An affinity bias is we seek out and feel comfortable with those who look like us, talk like us, have the same background as us, a variety of affinities where we recognize some commonality and we think that makes us closer. Now let's talk about us, each one of us. Do we have these biases? Absolutely. And this will not be a surprise to you. I think all of you have seen this. Again, I thought the Maryville article had the best approach to it. So Maryville said you start with all these characteristics: introspection, taking a personal inventory, mindfulness, perspective taking, learn to slow down, meaning about judgments, look for positive examples instead, individualization, check your messaging, institutional fairness, and then just recognizing it takes time. This was quite a long web page. But then whoever wrote it talked about the 3 things that they wanted you to be able to do. Be aware and proactive in being more inclusive. Spend time with people who are different from yourselves. And be proactive and take steps forward. So I went back to the interwebs, of course, and actually several months ago I had saved this next article again from Dorothy Dalton, and where she had a formula for being sure and acknowledging unconscious bias. The first one is self-awareness. We just saw that, take a self-inventory. The second is understanding, learning more about what biases are and the role they play in our lives and how we manage them, since they really you can't eliminate, especially unconscious implicit biases. The third one is recognizing and being able to name them when you see them. Now, she says there are more than 150 biases in total, and they are complex, they overlap, they have different names. And when you have an atmosphere of being able to acknowledge biases, it feels comfortable for people to do this in a neutral way. She gives a few examples. Rather than saying you're biased about that, she said something like, that's a bias that we may want to acknowledge. Very helpful language. And expedite is for you to not let biases pass by when you recognize them, whether in you or in others, but to immediately take action on it. If you start to judge, oh, that person looks poor because her car that I'm parked next to looks like it's in really bad shape, I have no idea what her story is. She could have had to borrow the car from someone else just for the day. That's the kind of bias that I found myself making the other day at the grocery store. So what should you do? I'm going to recommend, of course, take your own inventory. And Dorothy's article reminded me about the Harvard Implicit Bias Test, which I took last year and did a few years ago. I gave you a little bit of a view, the first page. It looks very much like a scientific research project. It's all written with a lot of words on it. You have to do this, you have to do that. Then the next page is, do you want to be an Asian bias, or they have all sorts of biases you can test yourself on. Most of us fail dramatically. We all fail because we all have some biases, but the awareness is really helpful. So now it comes to you, and I want you to recognize that the reason we went through this pretty quickly is because there's no one out there talking about what can we as individuals do to make sure we're managing ourselves and how we put ourselves out there, and what tools can we use. Lots of tools in the toolbox. Excuse me. The first that I wrote down over a year ago was making sure we're really careful about language. And most of us, me included, still have bad habits. You can move from non-inclusive language, from bias that shows your whatever conscious or unconscious bias you have. And I reminded each of you here we've done 2 webinars on them. Inclusive language, they were around gender, sports, military, ageism, violence, and what I call colonialism, things like stakeholders. And Elizabeth Grimm, an evaluator that I am friends with, who has written a guide on Words Matter. She has a 2-part blog on how and in what way we can change our language, including stakeholder. And it's important. It's really important to stop saying beneficiaries and start saying the people that we're collaborating with, for example, not even the people that we're helping. So that's one thing, really working on language. One of the things that I have noticed over and over again, and moving off of Twitter and moving on to the new platform called Threads, I'm seeing more and more is every generation still falls into the trap of its own music, its own making fun of itself in our dress. That's not so bad, I don't think. But also the language that we use. And I'm seeing that in older professionals, big LinkedIn experts that I like a lot, but their examples tend to come more from their generation rather than trying to appeal to a broader audience, even though I know these people, some of the people say they only work with 40 and above, but other people are available generally to the population who needs LinkedIn help. So think about the language. Don't make rapid gender judgments. The second part of what you can do is what I'm calling expanding the dimensionality of your visibility. And this is where tools are available to us virtually that we have not had before, a lot of virtual interactions. I want you to not hide yourself, be a role model. Add your pronouns if you haven't done it. I didn't notice until I went back to my profile and how LinkedIn really hides when you edit your profile, it's the same size. It's a text box. You put it in there and it's the same size. But look how small they are compared to your name and compared to even your headline. But I would encourage you to make sure that you have this filled in. You'll recognize also that this is the first box that you get to when people, or that is shown when people find you. So make sure that your headshot is publicly visible. In fact, so this is a link from Brenda Meller of Meller Marketing, who talks a lot about why people need to check their settings on what's visible, because it's visible to you and it may be visible to me as a first level connection, but sometimes people have totally locked down their photo. But this also goes for your entire profile if you're comfortable. Make sure you can be found. Make sure you can be a role model. We need to have everybody's examples out there of people who are conscious of the way in which they can put themselves out by participating in the virtual world. And the dimensionality especially gets amplified by the ability to use the record your name or name pronunciation option. I've probably said this several times in the last few years, and it's a big part of the course, but you have 10 seconds. So in 9 seconds, you can say your name, a tagline, something interesting about what you do, or you can just say your name. Why do you want to do this? Number one, you want to do this because it helps people understand and hear you. And when they hear you, you go from being a flat web page or a flat piece of paper if you're handing out a resume to, oh, I know what Sue looks like in her headshot. Now I can hear her voice. Now I've got a second dimension. So when someone sees me on the web, they will maybe remember, oh, I remember what her voice sounded like. I have a long list of name recordings now, people from the course, as well as people that I follow, like Brenda Meller and Ken Lang, who've done name record, if you want to listen to any. It's very easy to do. You do it on your mobile phone and then it's there. It's one thing you don't have to update. You have to update your picture. And then here's how you can show up for other people. We all are supporting each other as much as we can. And for most of us, LinkedIn is not the place that we're on 4 or 5 hours a day, or even, I think I'm probably there up to an hour a day. And yet that's a place we can show up, be allies to people who need disability, remind people of what they bring and how you know them, because I view endorsing people for skills as crowdsourcing, getting a crowd perspective of how people see me when I see, oh, these people endorsed me for public health or program evaluation, which are both things that I know, not epidemiology. I've had people do that before. But endorsing them gives you some way to say, and LinkedIn makes it harder now to find it. It used to be right at the top of a profile when you were searching for someone. But you can then show up and then they say, oh, Sue endorsed me for public speaking. I had no idea that she felt I was good at that. And hopefully it makes that person feel good, but also recognized for the visibility. Because when you give an endorsement, it's one more point they get a check off in LinkedIn's mind of 4 people endorsed her now. Oh, she's up to 10 now. So it's your profile, your professional presence, and then how you're using it. A lot of things to refer to, mostly from Dorothy Dalton, and a couple interesting articles in the Maryville University, and then the resources I mentioned. Just a reminder, this is short today because there's not much written out there about what you can do to take control of and put yourself out there to reduce implicit biases beyond your inventory. So let me stop there and Ron, do you have comments or questions? And actually, I have to give image credits because I borrowed this from Texas. So this is a good place to talk about this.
Yeah, no, for me, it's interesting. Some of them highlight my, I don't know, I guess I call them annoying things that annoy me. And see, I'm not a big sports person. I mean, I do like to pay attention to it and so on, but it's certainly not what I do. And because I'm ex-military, I notice those sorts of things. When military people get together, then there's the whole world of codes and so on and so forth. And so it's interesting. And it's the same, actually, healthcare professionals get together. There's those sorts of similar things. And so sometimes I think, certainly if it's topic related, in other words, bias directly related to healthcare, in other words, this is a healthcare job that I'm being interviewed for, I'm trying to access, then sure, is a bias? No, that's not the same. But it comes down to, I think, as you were trying to point out, is when we are interviewing or being interviewed, making certain assumptions. Oh, you're in the military. Okay, you get off on a side chat or something that is not directly related. And it might indicate, oh, well, the next candidate's not military, they're not going to get the same kind of treatment, well, therefore they're lower down the totem pole. That might be your colleague who's also interviewing, saying, well, wait a minute. And so there's these kinds of issues that you can imagine it's happening. Yeah, it's an interesting challenge, and like you say, it's natural. It's how humans survived. It's the shortcut that says, what's that? And then you react and then you go to safety. Our animal brain goes to safety. And so these things trigger and so on. And for me, I've been attending to some of them, and lots of this. Here I am, I'm in Quebec right now. And so I'm in a quite a different environment. And so there's a lot of mostly French spoken here. And every once in a while they hear Spanish. Oh, that's interesting. And so for me, that's attractive because I spend some of my time in Mexico. And so it's interesting how your brain triggers to these things, or the color of someone's skin. And I'm experiencing a very multicultural environment here this week, which is quite unusual. I've been here lots of times, and like even late in COVID, Ontario and folks from Montreal that was it. And that tended to be a primarily white population that either spoke French or English. Here, I'm running into some very interesting individuals who are from different environments, and it's interesting how you react. Oh, you respond, and sometimes it's just not negatively, but it captures your attention. And so the challenge I think that you've been advising us about is, okay, it can capture your attention, and it can be both good and bad. Often, and we think of the biases as being bad because, and you have negative. Sue, don't ever go near my car. because we deliberately have a car that looks like it's been hit because it has. And I'm not fixing it again. Anyway, but yeah, now it's an interesting challenge. It's an interesting topic. We all have it. And it's the real challenge is when it works against the process. And then if it's working for the process, is it too good? In other words, you're now, this person gets extra credits or something because whatever the bias is, whatever the connection is, et cetera. Now, the baseball cap. I don't wear a baseball cap. Does that keep me out? I don't like baseball caps, so I'm not allowed. I'm not allowed in the male community at all because they don't wear a baseball cap. I don't like them. Anyway, that's it. It's an interesting subject, and it ain't going away.
Thanks for your comments, because it really helps reinforce that having this chat about it does make it, sometimes if you're talking about it like you just said, what can you do while being aware of it? I'm curious from others. Anybody want to unmute and thoughts? Is this helpful to hear about? Even there are a lot of solutions of things you can do, but I think there are things that you can do that help normalize what we all want to see, which name record, for example, for me a couple of years ago when I learned about it was a big, let's normalize this. Anybody have anything I forgot about that you'd like to add that could help with your professional branding and making sure you're as bias-free and putting it out there? Peter, please, of course. Sujata, then you next.
Yeah, I really want to take the test and see what my biases are, but I have to wait until I feel like I'm ready to take the bad news. But I think that something that came up in a previous one that we talked about was the military, how you use that language. And I got to use that. We were doing emergency exercises in the Caribbean, and they kept calling it wargaming. And I was like, war is not a game. We are not talking about war, nor are emergencies a game. Why are you calling it wargaming? And I really liked that I got to call them out and have noticed that. So yeah, it feels good when you notice it and you see it and you're able to say, hey, this isn't good language. We should be speaking about this differently. I've used that in the past. I hope I'll be able to keep doing that if I get my next position.
Well, you get pom-poms for calling them out. It probably didn't make them do anything any differently. Yeah, I felt that. That's why I did that inclusive language. I had a company that talked about the war room, which was where we did our business development. Sujata, do you still want to go? Oh, welcome, Priyanka. I'll call on you after Sujata.
Yes, I would. I think about this quite a bit because of my name and also the way I look. I feel like some of the things you mentioned actually, for me, add to the implicit bias. And I thought about this when I recorded my name pronunciation, because then they hear my voice and there's implicit bias that goes with the way that I speak. And I've also, with my name, and like with my husband, just as an example, my husband has a unique name and he was having trouble getting a job. And then he changed his CV and his LinkedIn profile names to a common name and immediately started getting more interviews and got a job. And so I'm just having difficulty with some of the recommendations you made, whether they would actually help me fight against implicit bias.
Yeah, sure. Let me just say, Sujata, I'm so glad you brought up the name record. The reason that I think it's really important to do it is because, number one, I've become very aware that even in America, I have an accent. And when I go down to New Orleans and I'm down in one of the local restaurants I like, I can hardly understand them, and they probably can't understand me. And yes, they can, but yes, I understand. What I've tried to help people in the course to reassure them about the name record is that dimensionality. First of all, it's still pretty rare on LinkedIn, so people will notice it and listen to it. If they're not going to hire you because of an accent or your name, yeah, it's a problem. I can't believe that your husband is an actual model, actually a model of an experiment that I know they ran a few years ago where they changed names on African American resumes and the people got called in for interviews. But hang on, Ron. But I also think, Sujata, if we don't start putting our voice out there, it's not taking control of our side of the conversation and saying, this is who I am. And I will say, because you and others on this call know I come, and many of you do, from a long working relationship with USAID and global development, there are more and more unusual names, even within the AID corridors, and a lot in the last 10 years. And I think it's great. I think I would consider yourself, Sujata, on the vanguard of this, of using it as uncomfortable as you are about the recommendations I've made, using what you've been able to do to see if that helps. Most of what I preface that section with was be a role model. Get out there and start doing it. Ron, go ahead.
Yeah, I had an interesting experience. I may have spoken to you about this before, Sue, some time ago. A couple of years ago, I was working with a young woman from India who was healthcare software development. That's where she was working. And she had one name. Her name was Kriti. And I said, so what's your last name? And she says, I don't have one. And it was not a tradition where she was of taking family name. I don't quite understand the full, but it created some interesting challenges for her. And she, in fact, in some cases, her name was listed as Kriti, her first and last name, because I guess what's my last name is whatever is my name. And so it filled in the two boxes that are necessary. And so it's an interesting challenge, and she was able to survive the challenges, and she dealt with it because it started out actually at the university. She was there, and I encountered her when she was in an internship, and I was helping her trying to get into a permanent position. And it was interesting how it created minor problems, and these she felt pressured, including by me, only because I understood what they were trying to deal with, and you have these weird boxes on a piece of paper that suggest that somehow she has to have, she's required to have a last name. In the end, she worked it out, and I guess she did adopt a name that became the last name eventually. And so she caved into this bias that the system has for people, and so she became more Canadianized. This is what I have to say. Anyhow, she's doing great. She's been able to apply herself. She's got herself in a good position and all the rest of it. But it was curious to see how something simple as a name could really interfere.
Yeah, thank you, Sujata, for bringing this up and sharing what I need to hear, which is it's not always comfortable, even if you do things and you still face the bias. Priyanka, welcome.
Hi, Sue. I just I feel your pain. I myself am guilty of calling myself Bianca in certain places just so that people can remember me. I'm kind of getting over that kind of phase. But yeah, I want to say that it's so important to be aware of our implicit biases. In my case, I had this halo effect for one of my bosses, who is inadvertently the smartest person on earth. But in that halo effect, they did a lot of things that were borderline unethical and just not right, which, myself, my other coworkers excused. And as a result of it, now we dealt with a lot of confusion, so on and so forth. Long story. But it's important for us to question ourselves when we're coming through something, questioning ourselves and say, hey, why are we doing this? is it? What are my biases? It's very important, especially right now, the political environment that we're in, and of course with job searching as well. This comes at a very timely moment, this presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Priyanka. I love that you shared an example of what you identified. I have heard about the halo effect, and to be able to share with us, how difficult it is when you are in the middle of a situation where the halo effect is in place, and yet the person, company, whatever, is not doing what it needs to do. I am glad this is timely for some people. I work in the course to make sure, and with everybody I mentor individually, to make sure that I give you every recommendation I can think of to give you tools to put yourself out there and basically take control of your professional brand. That's what I've always done. So I appreciate the pain that all of you have shared today. It's hard. I think it's difficult. I grew up very much an idealist from my family. I mean, in terms of, the huge world, we all get along. And then I was raised in Massachusetts, but I had a African American biracial younger brother who was adopted, and and my mother was adopted. It was always, I didn't realize till I started working in global development when I first went to Haiti, met my first husband there, what kinds of things you started to deal with when I realized I was in countries where people prized the country you came from. Everybody wanted to go to America in the old days. I don't know that they still do. But I feel your pain. I think that the best thing we can do is surface these discussions. I hope you'll come up with ways that you can continue to keep me moving forward, honest with myself. And if I'm not being honest with you or information I'm putting out, please let me know. Please do not give me any halo effect. I do these because I'm interested in the topic. I try to give you what I think is out there, which is almost nothing, Priyanka, in terms of what you shared, Sujata, in terms of you shared. What kind of recourse do you have when your husband has to apply under a different name to get a job? There's no one place you can go and say, this and this are the same thing, and this didn't get him hired and this did. Please keep sharing anything that we're running, and I can help you with. Rob, another comment?
It's interesting. Having name record is a good thing, but also tools to help those of us who don't have agile tongues or mouths get around names that for us are complicated. And it's interesting. I ran into one of my favorite mentors who mentored me in the world of training, design, and development was a chap named Sivasalam Tyagarajan. And he actually used his name as a way of teaching people how to teach people how to do stuff. And so we actually, because his name is quite complex, but he had a rubric for helping those of us who don't have agile tongues say it. I say it's funny, I've got the name out more or less correctly the first go. So that is something to consider, only because recognizing, okay, that's a bias. I tend to be that way and so on, but I can do it if I'm helped to do it. So as a help for those of us, my bias in part, only because I know I have my own difficulty. And for some reason, I don't think anybody has trouble with my name because it's easy, supposedly. and just like you said, Sue, we have this general North American accent. So for us, generally, it's easy enough to do. However, I have actually encountered folks who stumble with my name. And that reminds me that not everybody has the same accent that I do. And I'm not going to go around saying I don't have an accent, because you're right, Sue. We have an accent also. And that's our bias. We can't get around it. So anyway, just a thought is that it can. It's interesting that you Priyanka, you used the idea of, I guess it was Bianca.
Bianca.
And so a way I would do that is it's like Bianca, but it's Priyanka or something like that. I mean, that might be a way of helping, but I understand in your case, you actually switched in part, by that it sounded like you said. And so that was to accommodate clumsy tongue clowns like me. And so that's gracious on your part. However, I should be able to say your name the way you would like me to say it. And so when you can be tolerant enough to help me get it right, I guess that's the challenge. And I'll try and do the same for you to try and say mine. Anyway, thank you.
You got it right, Ron. That's exactly what I started saying to people. Like, it's Bianca, but with a pre.
It's a great solution, Priyanka. I have to. So I want to ask Ron to close the meeting for us, please.
Yeah, interesting. I guess for you and I, Sue, this is an older topic. It's good to refresh it. And so thank everyone who's on the call to help us have this conversation. Thank you very much. And we're going to be getting together again in a couple of weeks' time to
a week. Yeah, we'll be talking about good enough.
That's right. Yes, that's remember. That's the week I won't be able to attend because I'll be traveling. I'll be returning to Nova Scotia that week. So thanks much for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you. And then I know Sue will see you next week.
Great, thank you. It's great to have your participation and really appreciate all the sharing that everybody did.